Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm here to talk to you about is three things. I'm going to try and seek to answer the question that came up earlier about what we can do to try and prevent or help commanders deal with these things. And we'll try and talk about three things: behaviour in war, understanding behaviour in war, and then what we might seek to do to control the behaviour in war as military commanders. Now, I'll talk about the descent into barbarism. Not going to work, is it? Okay. I'll talk about the descent into barbarism. Are we back up with this? Great. Talk about the descent into barbarism. And I think we've just had a really good example of this in terms of Rwanda. And I think if we're looking at something we're trying to prevent and avoid as military commanders, that's not a bad place to start with this definition of barbarism. So it's the absence of culture and civilization and a position of extreme cruelty and brutality. And if we find ourselves in those situations, as the Australian soldiers did in Rwanda, we're putting ourselves in a difficult position. So what I'm going to do is start by trying to get you thinking about behaviour in war, and we're dragging right down into the muck now in terms of tactical behaviour in war. So I'm going to take us through a couple of quick case studies of behaviour in war. I'm going to ask you to think about two things. So as we go through these case studies, what I want you to think about is responsibility and accountability of the individuals involved in these case studies. So how responsible should they be for their actions, and how accountable should we be holding them for what they've done? Okay, let's start in a pretty dark place, and I'm hoping that most people will recognise these. So this is Lieutenant William Calley. Now, William Calley was commanding a platoon in Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion, the 20th Infantry Regiment in the US Army in 1968. And on the 12th of March, he took his platoon along the rest of Charlie Company into the village of Son Mai, also known as My Lai. Now, over the next 9 hours, he and the rest of Charlie Company massacred between 350 and 500 Vietnamese civilians. No fighting-age males in the village. They came under no enemy fire at any stage whatsoever. Now, William Calley himself is of interest. He was the only person convicted for the My Lai massacre. He was convicted to life in prison, but he only spent 3.5 years in house arrest. But for me, what's really interesting is the rest of Charlie Company. There are 100 people in Charlie Company, and they'd only been in theatre for 3 months. So how do you go from 3 months from being a bunch of normal American kids to committing one of the worst massacres in US history? Now, personally, as a military commander, I find that interesting. So, as Time magazine asked after Calley was convicted, the question is who shares the guilt, and how far does that guilt go? You probably recognise these two happy individuals, Charles Grainer and Lindy England, who were responsible, or partially responsible, for Abu Ghraib as two of the protagonists in that involvement. And when we discuss the idea of bad apples, which is often the label given to people who take part in these incidents, we have to ask ourselves whether these two was the archetypal bad apples. But if you're actually interested in Abu Ghraib and you go into it a bit deeper, you suddenly find that on top of these two individuals who are very happy both with each other and doing things like that, the stacking of detainees on top of each other, you have to cast your net slightly wider. Now, a lot of people know about Charles Grainer, a lot of people know about Lindy England, but very few people know about the broader nets and people like Sergeant Chip Frederick. Now, Chip Frederick was the shift commander of Tier 1 Alpha, the night shift at Abu Ghraib. And he was equally happily conducting activities against the detainees. Now, he was psychoanalysed after when he was under court-martial, and he was found to have no sadistic or pathological tendencies. He was found to be an obliging, docile, and placating individual. He was found to be experiencing extreme exhaustion, the defining quality of burnout. And the psychotherapist who analysed him, who's Professor Philip Zimbardo, who you might know from the book The Lucifer Effect, found that the pervasive yet subtle power of a host of situational variables can dominate an individual's will to resist. Now, the conclusion Zimbardo came to was that Chip Frederick shouldn't be held accountable for his actions. He was a weak individual in an impossible situation, and he said that the normal man would have reacted in the same way or in a similar way. Now, the court-martial disagreed. However, it's an interesting perspective to look at. The final one I want you to think about is Sergeant Robert Bales. Anyone recognise Sergeant Bales? So Sergeant Bales was responsible for the Kandahar massacre in 2012. So he went out one night from his patrol base and he murdered 16 people in the local area, including a 4-year-old who was the youngest of the people he murdered. Now, of the 9 years that Sergeant Bales was in the army, he spent 4 of them on operations. He had received a traumatic brain injury in an IED strike and had been diagnosed with PTSD. And so they're back to those questions of responsibility and accountability. How responsible and accountable do we hold people for their actions in war? So, for us, as military commanders, I think we have to look at this slightly deeper as well. So we have responsibility and accountability, but then we also have predictability and preventability. And this is what I've spent the last 18 months thinking about, is how predictable and preventable might these actions have been. So, we've had a look at behaviour in war, and hopefully now you're all thinking about behaviour in war. Now, what I want to try and do now is bring out a bit more about understanding that behaviour in war. So, my own interest in this came from my own experiences in conflict, which started at a very interesting time joining the British Army in 2001. And one of my first things having joined the British Army was going to Iraq as a tank commander and taking part in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Latterly, I went back in Afghanistan and then was involved in the conduct of various kinetic strikes using fused intelligence and drone strikes. And then later on, also recently in 2013 and 2014, in an organisation that was very heavy in the use of snipers. And when I put all those things together over about 10 years and came back, and I was at the Staff College teaching in the UK, I started to really reflect on it, and I found a couple of kindred spirits who were also thinking about these things. Top right is Lieutenant Colonel Steve Hart, Royal Marines, and bottom left is a moral philosopher called Dr. David Wetham, who teaches ethics at the Staff College. And between us, we sat down for a period of time, and we tried to consider and to conclude what we felt drove behaviour in conflict. And we came up with a pretty simple model, which was this. We thought there were three things that were driving behaviour in conflicts amongst soldiers. And they were individual agency, your own choices, and your own predilections to how you deal with stress and how you deal with the choices you make. Situational pressure, the pressure of the situation upon you. And group culture, the culture of the group in which you were involved. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and take you through these in a bit more detail. I don't have a huge amount of time, so what I'm going to park, really, is individual agency. I'm not going to talk about that in any great length. However, what I do want you to think about, particularly the military commanders amongst you, is that the individuals who are given to you at the age of 18, normally the minimum age they'll come and serve in the military on operations, have already had 18 years of formative experiences from their upbringing and from their education. And so those predilections, those preset reactions to things like stress and violence are pretty preset. And there's actually fundamentally not much you can do to change that. That's why equally it's really important that we spend time as institutions considering and remembering and understanding how we filter out those people who are predisposed to violence and brutality. And most people will recognise Corporal Clayton Matchey from the Canadian Airborne Regiment, who was involved in the Somalia affair in 1993. Now, he had predilections to violence. He should not have been in the military, and he should not have been in Somalia conducting those activities. So just think for a second about how we do that. How do we filter out people for moral character? Now, most militaries do it through previous criminal convictions. So we won't allow people with criminal convictions to join the military. Very logical, makes a lot of sense. However, what's also interesting to note over the last 10 years is how pressure on manning and pressure of operations might have driven those standards down. It's worth noting in a recent study that in 2006, the US military, and I'm not bashing the US military here, it's just an example, and it's one that data is available for, granted 35,000 moral waivers to those who didn't meet the good character standards that they applied by law. That was 19.6% of all enlistments, almost double from 1997. In the US Marine Corps, so over 50% of enlistments in 2006 were waived previous convictions to allow them to join the Marine Corps, a five-fold increase from the previous 10 years. Now that would create concerns for me about the moral bedrock of an organisation. So that's the individual. I'm not going to do any more on that. It is worth noting with these that the bottom left is PFC Stephen Green, who was responsible for the rape and murder of a 14-year-old Iraqi girl in Murmadiyah in the Triangle of Death in Baghdad in 2006. He was in receipt of one of those moral waivers. And if you want to look at it in a bit more detail, go and have a look at the book Lethal Warriors, which follows the 506th, the band of brothers on their return from Iraq in 2006, where the rape cases around Fort Carson doubled in the 3 years that followed, and there were 11 murders committed by soldiers within Fort Carson. It's worth considering those moral bedrocks of a force. So, behaviour in war. Situational pressure. I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail. Okay, so hopefully most of you have a sort of background to think about this a lot, which is pretty much this audience will recognise Philip Zimbardo and will understand the Stanford Prison Experiment. So a general nod from the room that people have had any experience with the Stanford Prison Experiment. So 24 college students in 1970 taken into an experiment, split into guards and prisoners, put into a simulated prison environment for up to 14 days to see how they reacted to that environment. The experiment had to be stopped after 6 days because the guards started brutalising the prisoners both physically and emotionally. Okay, brought to a halt by the guy running it. Now what Zimbardo said, and I've already mentioned it, is he felt that the situation, the power of that situation that he created on those people led to them absolving their own individual predilections, becoming part of a corrupted situation. And he said the pervasive yet subtle power of a host of situational variables can dominate the individual's will to resist. Now, from my experience of conflict, this is absolutely the case within the situation of war. I'll talk about the nature of war a bit more later on, but for me, the nature of war is to corrupt. And I say that happens in three ways. So my idea is that the corruption power of war takes place in three ways. The first one is that the exposure to the situation of war provides power that is not held in any other place. And that generally is the power to kill. So it's the power to apply violence. That is not a normal thing that you have. If you go and read John Keegan's The Face of Battle, he says that physical knockdown violence is very irregular in normal society now. But in the situation of war, you have that power to kill. You then add to that a distinct lack of social control, the actual destruction of that social control that you normally have that keeps people on the straight and narrow during the day-to-day basis, that lack of constraint that you have in society that you don't have in the situation of war. If you add into that horrible mix the idea of visceral emotions, extreme heightened emotions like terror, hatred, disgust, and revenge, if you mix those three things together, what you find at the end of it is a corrupting power of war that can break people away from their normal ethical guidelines. I'll try and give you a quick example, and I'll build you a quick battle space. There's a border, there's Kuwait, there's Iraq, there's some bad guys in Iraq, there's a tank, probably with me in it, in Kuwait. And at that stage, in FAA Barnsley, a wonderful lined-up bunch of soldiers ready to go and cross the border, it was clear in reflection that those controls were in place. We had social controls around us. They were very similar to the social controls we have around us today. That power in terms of rules of engagement was enclosed, and those social controls, that visceral emotion, was still not there. However, on reflection, the instant we crossed that border, we saw that change. Those social controls started to break down. The power, through the release of those rules of engagement, started to come up, and those visceral emotions in terms of excitement and fear also started to expose. When you finally then bring yourself into contact with the enemy, that's when you really see those social controls become threatened. The power to kill, the power to apply violence expresses up, and the visceral emotions that come out of that in terms of fear, in terms of excitement, in terms of those emotional involvements in conflict really come to the heights. Now, interestingly, in conventional conflict, this isn't too difficult to control. But when you start reflecting on the conflicts that we fought over the last 10 years, the ethical risks that we felt have been higher. And that comes down to a number of facets, a number of ideas about the style of conflict in which we're fighting that releases those controls, puts those three things together to become that corrupting nature of war. Now, I sort of cite as three examples of that the idea of societal rifts and dehumanization. So when we go and fight people, when we go and have enemies who are far apart in society from ourselves, it's much easier for those enemies to be dehumanized. And I think if you look at MAJ, that's a really good example of how that dehumanization was able to take place because of that societal rift. If you go into conflicts where the enemy is faceless, it's very difficult to discriminate that enemy from the normal population that sits around. And you go into conflicts where soldiers are faced with a persistent fear of death, prolific IED environments. You go back to Charlie Company from MAJ. Charlie Company received 29 casualties in their 3 months in Vietnam without really any contact with the enemy whatsoever. That was all from booby traps and from explosives. If you apply MAJ to that, you can very much see how those three things come together to create that situation of war that creates ethical risk for the soldiers. So, we've had a look now at the situational pressure. Let's have a look at the group culture, which is the other facet that I want to bring out in terms of understanding the behaviours in war. So, looking back at another psychological experiment. Everyone happy with Stanley Milgram? Everyone come across the Milgram experiments? General nod from across the audience, pretty much. So Stanley Milgram did an experiment between 1961 and 1963. It was a reflection on Adolf Eichmann, who was the logistician in charge of the Holocaust and his trial in Israel. He wanted to understand obedience to authority. So he set up an experiment where he put people in a fake scenario to see how far they would go if they were pushed to do so by an authoritarian character. And it involved shocking with electric shocks an actor behind a screen. When he asked his psychological comrades, when he asked his psychotherapical comrades how many people they felt would go all the way to the top of the 450 volts in his experiment, they reckoned about 1 or 2% of people would go all the way. What Milgram found was that 65% of people shocked all the way to a fatal level when encouraged to do so by a situation and by a person of authority. Okay? Now, a lot of people know about the Milgram experiments. Very few know about Solomon Ash's conformity experiments that took place about 10 years before. Now, what Solomon Asch tried to do in about 1950 was to try and understand how groups drive the individuals within them, and whether individuals will stick with their own decisions or whether they will follow the decisions and lines of groups. So what Asch did was he took subjects, he put them in a group with 8 actors, and he asked them to compare lines. And he said, you've got a line there on the left-hand side, tell me which one, A, B, or C, that line matches on the right-hand side. The actors purposely chose the wrong lines, and he wanted to see how many people would go with their own decisions and how many people would go with the group. About 75% of people went against their own decisions and went with the group. About 32% did so consistently. And he continued to build that idea that the group has power over the individual. Now, when you talk about groups, you talk about primary groups. Families are primary groups. And what we try and do in the military is we try and bring soldiers, upon their inoculation into the military, into primary groups. A group that will push them in a direction that we want them to go in. And most of the time, that leads to extreme levels of heroism. We can push people to go and do things that they might not normally do. So there's great benefit in the idea of primary groups and that group adherence. But the problem is that groups are agnostic. Groups can push very, very positive senses, or they can push very negative senses. And I would say that the 70% of people from Charlie Company who participated in the My Lai massacre, most of them did so because the group did so. If you go and look at POC Stephen Green and the company he was involved in, Mohammadiyah, when they murdered the Iraqi girl and her family, what you found is that the group corruption was infectious to those who arrived. So battle casualty replacements who arrived in the environment didn't have to go through a slow corruption of their ethical compass. They were abusing prisoners within days of arriving, because that's what the group was doing. So as we as military officers have to understand the power that group has to control behaviour in war. So those two things, situation and group. Overlaying over that is the individual predilections that sit with it. So we've had a look at understanding behaviour in war. What I want to now talk about is how we control that behaviour in war, and the idea of what we can do in terms of social engineering and the engineering of our groups to try and control their behaviour in war. We talk a lot about resilience at the minute. We talk a lot about physical resilience, but I think there's a much deeper part of spiritual resilience that we need to talk about when we talk about how we prepare soldiers for operations. What we're trying to do is we're trying to take this fresh-faced young soldier, be British, be Australian, be American, wherever he comes from, and we're trying to stop him from turning into this individual, who you can't see particularly well on the screens. But this is a photo study that was done by a photographer of American soldiers coming out of Iraq after a 12-month combat tour. And you can see the pain and the experience in this individual's face. What we can do is we can start using the benefits of what we just talked about what influences and understands behaviour in war, is we can use those things to control those behaviours in war. And the one thing we can leverage more than anything else is the group. So this is a group that I commanded in Afghanistan between 2013 and 2014. And we spent a lot of time thinking about what was our group dynamic. Now, my reflection on that, and having done some work with some of the moral philosophers at KCL, is actually the way we control groups is through the expression of a very, very old moral philosophical approach. And it was mentioned by Professor Dunlap, which was the virtue ethic. In the end, we as military leaders design virtue ethics for our soldiers. And we try and use those virtue ethics to push those soldiers in a certain direction. The virtue ethic is a very old moral philosophical approach. First from Aristotle, it's a normative set of ethics that bases on virtues of mind and character, and it's one of the oldest forms of ethics. And if anyone wants to go and look in a bit more detail, there's an excellent book by Stephen Coleman from UNSW, Military Ethics and Introduction with Case Studies, where he looks at virtue ethics in great sense. So how do we create a virtue ethic amongst the soldiers who we command? Now, the reality is that most of the virtue ethic, we can do it in smaller groups, but the basis of that virtue ethic is the culture of the organisation, the institutional culture in which it sits. And that normally sits from the basis, a bedrock of tradition and a bedrock of history. Now, for the Australian Army, the Anzac Legend is the basis of the virtue ethic for the Australian Army. For the British Army, it's a bit more regimental. You find that the regiments themselves, because of the older histories, have slightly more enclosed virtue ethics amongst the regiments. And each military has their own set of it. Now, there is a question that I won't seek to answer here about the suitability of some of these legends for the future. And as demographics change, sometimes you have to answer the question about whether the traditional historical virtue ethics of organisations are suitable for the future. Now, those virtue ethics are often expressed in individuals. We still have a heroic legend, so to speak, within the army. And you can see those heroic individuals who are expressed. You've got Ben Roberts-Smith up there as part of that personification of that virtue ethic. So what does it try and do? Well, the virtue ethic tries to do three things. It tries to set an internalised code of personal conduct. It tries to tell soldiers how they should act. It gives them a preset series of actions that they should follow, particularly under pressure. It then provides a reward system to those who follow the cycle, Those reward systems can be in the expression of medals and the expression of congratulatory reports, but also it's a peer reward system and an internal reward system in terms of your own honour and satisfaction of doing the job. That then becomes, hopefully, a mutually reinforcing cycle that you can use within organisations to continue to push those actions. The problem is that just like everything else we've discussed, is a virtue ethic can be agnostic. It can drive negative activity as much as it drives positive activity. And if you have a virtue ethic like the soldiers did in Alpha Company in Murmadaya when they murdered that 14-year-old Iraqi girl, you can have a virtue ethic that provides a reward system to negative behaviour, a virtue ethic that provides a mutually reinforcing cycle that drives that negative behaviour. An example that many of you won't have heard of is Sergeant Al Blackman. Now, Sergeant Al Blackman was a Royal Marine who in 2012 was filmed on a helmet camera shooting a wounded Afghan insurgent, having taken them out of the sight of the PGSS balloon, the base ISR, so they could take them to one side and shoot him. Now, when Sergeant Blackman shot the individual in the chest, he turned round and he said to his soldiers who were under his command, "This goes no further, guys, I've just broken the Geneva Convention." Now, you would expect the virtue ethic of the Royal Marines, which is a 300-year-old organisation, to reject that behaviour. All he got from the guys with him was, "Yep, roger, mate, no dramas." So the question you have to ask is, what was so overwhelming as to break the virtue ethic of a 300-year-old organisation and make that behaviour acceptable to the others around him? Now, at the heart of most virtue ethics are a set of values. And I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about military values, because it's something we often take for granted that we have a value set within a military organisation. What I want to do is I want to ask you to think about language for a minute. So, there are a series of value sets for a series of militaries. From the Australian Army through to the People's Liberation Army. Not particularly easy to find, it was a US Marine Corps source that got them. But that apparently is the set of values for the PLA. Most of them are actually virtues in terms of virtue ethic, but take a second to have a look at the language. Number of continuities between them. The problem again with things like this is that they're easily corruptible. Unless you tailor the language to make it reflective of a virtue ethic that is based on something much deeper and intangible than things like loyalty, than things like courage, then they're easily corruptible. So, there's a very good one, the Australian Army contract, known by all soldiers. However, by the removal of one word from the Australian Army contracts, you can very easily turn it into this. This is not real. I've made this up. I'm an Islamic State soldier who's an expert in close combat. I'm physically and mentally tough and courageous. I lead by example. I strive to take the initiative. I am committed to learning and working for the team. I believe in trust, loyalty and respect for my country, mates and army. The black flag is my badge of honour and I am an Islamic State soldier always. I've removed one word. You want to tell me what that word was? Compassionate. So if we don't consider the language that we use within these, and it's of note that respect was added to the Australian Army values relatively recently, if we don't think about the language, we're never going to get out of these what we're after. So I've highlighted there a series of words that I think are actually the action words, the ethical words that sit within some of these value sets. And it's interesting to see how some armies quantify them. So respect for others in the British Army, loyalty to country within the Singaporean Armed Forces. It's also notable the British Army uses a set of standards that sit underneath this of lawful, appropriate, and totally professional. And then what they're trying to do is they're trying to establish a grounding of values on life and liberty. So I ask you to think about that in terms of how we shape the behaviours of our soldiers in conflict. There's this bunch of soldiers, interesting bunch. Anyone seen this before? Looking pretty happy, mess event. That's the Reserve Police Battalion 101 from the German army, who were the greatest killers of the Holocaust outside of the gas chambers. The 500 soldiers in that battalion shot 83,000 Jews. That's about 178 each, on average. Now, they had an ethic, and they had a value set. Just think about that. Okay, the devil is in the detail. What I want to talk about very quickly is iconography. This was the emblem we brought up for my organisation when I went to Afghanistan. It's pretty standard. It has a reconnaissance flag in it, other bits and pieces. It's all fine. What was prolific out there at the time was that, which I didn't like. I don't like things that involve the dehumanization of an enemy. And I don't like the idea of hunting other men. I was quite surprised to find the 101st Aviation Regiment from the US military has the motto, expect no mercy. Again, I don't think that necessarily gives out particularly positive connotations to the use of force and the controls that sit upon it: proportionality, discrimination, and necessity. Equally interestingly, this is a photo from about 2 weeks ago from US forces supporting the Kurdish forces on the edges of Iraq. If you zoom in, you can find the chap wearing a very nice hate flash on the front of his body armour. Again, if you think about that in terms of iconography and a virtue ethic, how positive is that in terms of what you're building around your force? Okay, so what I want to put across very quickly now is I don't see this as being an ephemeral thing. This is something you can very much leverage when you're approaching an operation. So, if you have a virtue ethic that you designed, there's some soldiers, there's a group, there's a virtue ethic that sits in the middle of it. If you can apply that into your situation of war, what you can do is conduct an ethical threat assessment, an assessment of the dangers you face within your particular situation and the soldiers you're going to put into it. And if you can do that, you can start putting up some flags that allow you to control it. The final point I'll bring up before I go into those closing thoughts is that for me, it's the situation of war is the bit you need to look at the most, because that's the one on which you have the least control over it. And if you find yourself in a situation of war that has these things, big societal rifts, dehumanized enemies, a consistent fear of death, high casualty rates and facelessness, you're in a situation of extreme ethical stress. And that's where you may find that guys are going to be drawn into a situation where they might do the wrong things. It's those situations that turn that soldier into that unhappy face, which you can't quite see on those slides. And at the end of it, what you might see is hopelessness, hatred, disgust, and revenge. And it's those visceral emotions, for me, that provide the gateway to barbarism. It's worth noting that it is a new thing that we are asking soldiers to spend so much time in combat for existing periods of time. The average rotation period of time in the First World War in the trenches was 16 days. During World War II, frontline units were rotated out every 80 days. And John Keegan, in The Face of Battle, argued that soldiers start to decline in usefulness after 90 days in combat. The idea of putting someone into 12 months of day in, day out, 365 a year combat is new. And we have to think about whether that is the right thing to do and how we deal with those ethical situations. Back to My Lai. Why did he do it? Because he felt he was ordered to do it. It seemed like that at the time he felt he was doing the right thing because he'd lost buddies. He lost a damn good buddy, Bobby Wilson, and it was on his conscience. That was one of the soldiers from My Lai's reason why he conducted the My Lai massacre. Ethical stress. Okay, final thoughts. Clausewitz tells us that the nature of war is enduring. Okay, I'm not the first person to mention Clausewitz today, but Clausewitz tells us the nature of war is enduring, and I absolutely agree with that. I also agree with Sergeant Sammy David, the Medal of Honor winner, that war is always an assault on the humanity of all the individuals caught up in it, and we need to provide soldiers with the right defences to deal with that assault upon humanity when they go into those situations of war. The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never made up their minds to be good or evil. Now, that was a phrase coined by Hannah Arendt when she interviewed Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, who was the logistician responsible for the Holocaust. She was amazed by how normal he was, and she coined the phrase the banality of evil. He never decided to be good or evil. He was drawn into it. If you don't believe in that, then believe in the strategic implications, which we've already heard from Professor Dunlap. Okay, this is General Krulak, Strategic Corporal, the inescapable lesson of Somalia and of other recent operations, whether humanitarian, peacekeeping or traditional warfighting, is their outcome may hinge on the decisions made by small unit leaders and by actions taken at the lowest level. That, very quickly, becomes that, which is murals from Abu Ghraib on the streets of Tehran. A constant assault on the moral foundations of American operations overseas. So, as Colin Gray said, in strategy, ethics are a survival necessity and not a luxury. And I'll leave the final point to Mr. Hunter from Crimson Tide, one of the great understanders of Clausewitz, that the purpose of war may be to serve a political end, but the true nature of war is to serve itself. Thank you very much.
Now, your questions, if you just let us know who you are, and please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Everyone's keen for lunch, I think.
Question in front of you. Professor Dunlap.
Charlie Gillett. Absolutely brilliant presentation.
Thank you, sir.
The best I've ever seen, ever. I've seen it. Let me ask you a question on the dehumanization of
Yeah.
the enemy. Is there a balance to be made there? Because, you know, when we go to survival training, they tell us to humanize ourselves with the enemy because then it's going to be harder for the enemy to kill us. And I think that that does play out. Is there a balance, and what advice would you have?
It's a really tricky one, and when we looked in depth at that idea of a societal rift, you can do a comparison to conventional warfare. Now, we traditionally have been able to dehumanize an enemy force by focusing on a uniform. So if you went to the Falkland Islands, for example, the Argentinians were soldiers, but we focused on fighting a uniform, not fighting the individuals within them to a certain extent. And you saw it in the language used. The nickname for the Argentinians amongst the British forces was the Argies. As soon as you lose that uniform and you get that facelessness, particularly with a distant society that looks very different, has different beliefs, religious beliefs, societal beliefs, you see that dehumanization come in. I don't know how you try and focus that dividing line between an enemy and a civilian. I think some of the rules of engagement training that we've done over the last few years has been really helpful. But the reality is it has to come down to each individual soldier's ability to do that, how you prepare them for it. The only other way to do it really is to try and define those labels. You know, how do we give that identity to those individuals? Luckily, people like ISIS are now finding that they want to give themselves that identity, which makes them much easier to target, if you know what I mean. So, not an easy answer to a question, but I don't really have an answer for that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Question.
Hello, my name is Natalia. I'm from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you very much, Major. That was really fascinating to hear, and it's very relevant to some work that ICRC is doing. We have conducted a study called The Roots of Behaviour in War, which looked at exactly this issue. Why do people in the field make the decisions they make? And currently we're looking at a review of the study, which came to similar conclusions that you have made about individual agency, the situation that people find themselves, but also the huge power of group culture. So your point about leveraging that power is very interesting. My question is, what you tend to hear is that if you want better soldiers who are going to act in particular ways, they need better training, that it comes down to training. And you have really emphasised the group culture, value, virtue ethic, etc. Do you see that there is a role to play in the training? And I'm sure there is, but in terms of the comparison to focusing on what kind of group or identity people find themselves in, what is the role to play in terms of the training that is given to individuals to understand, as other people have been saying, what are the ethical considerations and what are the legal frameworks that give not only restraints, but permission to act in particular ways? Thanks.
You know, I think training absolutely can help. And Nancy Sherman, who wrote the book Stoic Warriors, says that a large part of evil consists in its novelty. But if evil has been pondered beforehand, the blow is gentle when it comes. So training can certainly help. And I think that the way we tailor our training in terms of the putting people through genuine ethical dilemmas compared to tests of integrity, and there is a difference, and Dean will tell you all about the difference between, not right now, he's shaking his head, but the difference between a test of integrity and a ethical dilemma. Rwanda ethical dilemmas, I think, you know, I don't know whether you agree with that, sir. So training can help, but actually the heart of all of this, and I don't have time to talk about this bit, is leadership. In the end, if you don't get the leadership element of this right, to consciously understand and design a virtue ethic for an organisation that all the time, 24 hours a day, reinforces a certain direction of behaviour, you're never going to put enough of a safety net in. So behind all of this is leadership. However, you're right that considerations of training are practical, and if we can train people to have pre-thought some of the decisions they might have to make, then that's a fantastic thing. What we really try to do when we put people overseas in operations is construct social controls around them that they can understand and work within. And if we don't do that, again, as institutions, we're not being responsible to those people in terms of giving them the proper structures around them to help them control their own decision making. If that makes sense.
Would you please thank Tom for his presentation?